I want to be upfront about something before I get into these stories. All three people who sent these in asked me to hide their names. That's normal. But two of them specifically asked me not to mention the exact location anywhere in Appalachia. Not because they were embarrassed. Not because they thought people wouldn't believe them. But because they were genuinely afraid the people watching them out there might recognize the stories. If you've ever spent time deep in the Appalachian Mountains, you already know how isolated some of those places can feel. And after hearing what happened to these people, that isolation starts feeling a lot less peaceful. I've debated whether to send this in for a long time, mostly because one part of it still doesn't make complete sense to me, and I don't want to sound like I'm exaggerating. I'm not. I'm going to tell it exactly as it happened and let you make of it what you will. 4 years ago, I rented a cabin in the Appalachian for a solo trip. I do this every year or so. I'm in my mid-30s, I live alone, and I find that a few days completely off the grid reset something in me. I had been to this particular cabin once before, 2 years prior, without any issues. I was comfortable there. That matters. I arrived on a Friday afternoon. The cabin was a 45-minute drive from the nearest town and sat at the end of a long gravel path off a Forest Service road. There was a creek about 200 feet behind it. The nearest other structure was a decommissioned ranger station about a mile east that I had walked to on my previous visit. It had been locked up and clearly unused. Everything was normal through Friday night and all of Saturday. On Saturday evening, just before dark, I noticed that the tree line behind the cabin seemed different somehow. I stood on the back porch for a while, trying to figure out what was bothering me about it. It took me a few minutes to realize what it was. There were no sounds coming from it. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just complete silence from the woods, where there had been noise all day. I went inside and locked the back door. Around midnight, I woke up and couldn't place why. The cabin was dark and quiet. I reached for my phone out of habit before remembering I had no service. I lay there for a minute, and then I smelled something. Wood smoke, faint but distinct. I got up and looked out the back window. About 300 feet into the tree line, there was a fire. Small, controlled, the size of a campfire. I watched it for a long time. It didn't grow, didn't move. Someone had built a fire in the woods directly behind the cabin I was staying in at midnight. I want to explain what that felt like because I think it's important. It wasn't the fire itself that was frightening. It was the deliberateness of it. The distance was too precise. Far enough back to be in the tree line, close enough that whoever built it could see my cabin clearly. I turned off every light inside. I sat in the dark near the front window for the rest of the night, with a knife on the table in front of me. By the time daylight came, the fire was out. I couldn't see any movement. I packed up and drove the gravel path out to the Forest Service road, and that's where I found it. A piece of notebook paper folded under my windshield wiper. I hadn't parked anywhere public. I had parked at the end of a private gravel path 45 minutes from the nearest town. I unfolded it. There were 4 words written on it in large, careful handwriting. "You should go home." I drove directly to the nearest town and called the police from a gas station. An officer came out and took a report. He told me they occasionally had issues with people in that stretch of the forest who didn't take well to outsiders. He said it as though it was a minor inconvenience. I don't think he understood that someone had known exactly which vehicle was mine, had known I was there alone, and had watched me through the night from the tree line. I have never gone back to that area. I don't think I ever will. This was about 6 years ago. I was 31 at the time and going through a pretty rough stretch after losing my job. Nothing dramatic, just a layoff. But it hit me harder than I expected. I needed to get out of my head for a while, and a friend of mine offered to let me use his family's cabin for a week. It was in a remote section of the Appalachian, accessible only by a fire road that took about 40 minutes to drive once you left the main highway. No cell service once you were past a certain point. No neighbors. Just trees and quiet. I want to be clear that I'm not someone who gets rattled easily. I grew up hunting. I've spent plenty of nights alone in the woods. None of that is relevant until it is. The first 2 days were exactly what I needed. I read, I slept, I cooked simple meals and sat on the porch and watched the light change through the trees. By the third morning, I felt genuinely better. That matters because I want you to understand that I was calm and clear-headed when things started happening. That afternoon, I went for a walk down the fire road. Maybe a mile out, I noticed tire tracks in the soft dirt that hadn't been there the day before. Fresh ones, wide set, probably a truck. I stood there, looking at them for a moment. The road only led to my friend's cabin. There was nothing else at the end of it. I told myself it was probably someone who had turned around partway down the road. That was the reasonable explanation, and I held on to it. That night, I was reading by the fire when I heard a vehicle moving slowly somewhere on the road outside. No headlights came through the windows, which was strange. If someone was driving down that road at night, they would have needed lights. I went to the window and looked out, but couldn't see anything. The sound faded after a few minutes. I didn't sleep well that night. The following morning, I walked the fire road again. The tire tracks were still there from the day before, but now there was a second set on top of them. Someone had come back down the road during the night and then left again. There was no reason for anyone to be on that road, none. My friend had confirmed before I left that no one else had access to the property and that the road wasn't a through road to anywhere. I spent that day inside. I checked the locks, which felt almost ridiculous given that it was a cabin in the middle of nowhere with basic hardware locks on hollow core doors. I found a hatchet in the woodshed and kept it near the bed that night. Around 2 a.m, I heard it, a slow idle, like a vehicle sitting at the edge of the clearing with its engine running but no lights on. I didn't move for a long time. I lay in bed and just listened. It ran for what felt like 10 minutes and then it was gone. I left the next morning. I didn't tell my friend why I cut the trip short because I didn't have a good explanation that wouldn't sound paranoid. I told him I was feeling better and just wanted to get home. It wasn't until a few weeks later when I mentioned it to him casually that his response unsettled me all over again. He went quiet for a second and then told me the same thing had happened to his brother 2 summers before. A vehicle, no lights, sitting at the edge of the clearing at night. His brother had also left early. My friend had never told him about it either because he didn't want to think about what it meant. Neither of us has figured that out. This happened 3 years ago, and it's the reason I no longer go anywhere alone if I can help it. I want to get that out of the way up front because I think it says something about how seriously I still take it. I grew up in the Appalachian, in a small town in western North Carolina. My family had a piece of land up in the mountains that had been passed down a couple of generations. There was a small cabin on it that my grandfather had built by hand. Simple place. 1 main room, a small loft, a wood stove, an outhouse, maybe 40 feet out the back. No electricity, no running water. When I was a kid, my family used it for hunting trips. After my grandfather passed, it sat unused for years. In my late 20s, I went through a divorce and found myself needing somewhere to be that wasn't my apartment and wasn't anyone else's place. I remember the cabin. I drove up one weekend to check on it, and it was in rough shape but livable. I started going up there pretty regularly, usually for 3 or 4 days at a time. It helped me. Being somewhere that had nothing to do with my regular life made things easier to process. I had been going there for about 6 months without any problems when I noticed the first thing. Someone had been in the cabin while I was away. I could tell because specific items had been moved, not dramatically. A cup had been placed on a different shelf. The wood stove had fresh ash in it that I hadn't left. The blanket on the cot was folded differently than I folded. Individually, any of those things could have been my own misremembering. Together, they felt intentional. I checked the exterior of the cabin and found no signs of forced entry. The door had a simple padlock, and it was intact, which meant whoever had been inside either had a key, which made no sense, or was skilled enough to get in and out without leaving obvious signs. I told myself it was probably someone from the area who used the cabin occasionally during deer season, figured no one would mind, and had no idea anyone was using it again. That was a reasonable explanation. I added a second lock to the door and moved on. 3 weeks later, I arrived for another stay and noticed something immediately. There was a chair on the front porch that hadn't been there before. It wasn't one of ours. It was an old wooden chair, painted dark green, and it had been placed directly in front of the door, facing outward, facing the path that led up to the cabin. The implication of that felt very specific to me. Someone had sat in that chair and watched the path, waited for someone to come up it. I should have turned around. I know that now. Instead, I went inside, told myself I was being dramatic, and stayed the night. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to the sound of footsteps on the porch. Slow, unhurried, like someone who wasn't worried about being heard. They stopped directly in front of the door. I grabbed the hunting knife I kept under the cot and sat up. The footsteps didn't move for what felt like a very long time. Then they crossed to the left side of the porch and stopped again. Then silence. I sat in that exact position until it was light enough to see. When I finally opened the door, the porch was empty. The green chair was still there, but now there was a second item next to it. A glass jar with a candle stub inside, the kind you'd keep in a storm kit. It wasn't mine. Someone had walked onto the porch in the middle of the night and left something behind. Not as a threat, exactly, but as a message that they'd been there, that they knew I was there, that they could come back whenever they wanted to. I pulled the padlocks off the door, loaded my things into the truck, and drove down off that mountain without stopping. I called my uncle, who was the only other family member with any connection to that land, and told him the whole story. He was quiet for a long time. Then he told me that 15 years ago, before my grandfather passed, there had been an incident with a man from somewhere deeper in the mountains who had fixated on the property. My grandfather had dealt with it and never spoken about exactly how. My uncle didn't know the details. He just knew the man had never come back. Until apparently someone started using the cabin again.